Twitter, a platform which started as a way to tell your 18 followers that you just bought a loaf of wholemeal bread, which would later grow to over 500 million users worldwide. Heads of state use Twitter to address entire nations. Emergency services use the platform to give public service announcements, and game companies use the site to disappoint people with text walls that look like this. This history of Twitter's growth from looking as ugly as Amazon's website to now being considered critical infrastructure on the internet is long and storied. However, there is no bigger turning point for the company than its acquisition by billionaire Elon Musk in 2022, all for the low price of $44 billion. Musk's stewardship of Twitter is such a fascinating topic because although considered so integral to online communication, his complete ownership gives him unprecedented control over the platform. If he was so inclined, there would be absolutely nothing stopping him from turning the logo into a picture of his own face, removing the ability to post pictures, or making it exclusively accessible to people named Larry. Now obviously this hasn't happened, but Musk's other decisions following his acquisition are now used as a case study in some business schools, as the gold standard for how not to implement organizational change. Let's look at the story of one of the most high-profile acquisitions in history, what it might mean for the future of the internet, and what happens when a single person has unlimited power in a space filled with 500 million people. Elon Musk's relationship with Twitter goes back long before he even considered owning the platform, first creating his account in 2009 and gaining over 180 million followers. To say he's a heavy user would also be an understatement, having tweeted over 43,000 posts as time of writing, or roughly 8 times a day since he signed up. His first step to actually acquiring the company, however, began at the dawn of 2022, when he would start buying publicly available shares. Before long, Musk would become its largest shareholder, owning a 9.2% stake. And this is where we start delving into the fun world of corporate politics. After becoming the company's largest shareholder, Twitter's Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee would recommend for Twitter's board of directors to invite him to be a member. They argued that his ownership stake, technical expertise, as well as being such a heavy user justified him such a spot at the table. The board was a bit more cautious, however. Firstly, Musk knew 2 of the board members, which included being friends with its then current CEO, Jack Dorsey. Secondly, the company was worried about the adverse effects of what might happen if he tried to take the company private, which as it turns out was a well-founded concern. What might have tilted their perspective, however, was the possibility that Musk would attempt to create a rival to Twitter, something he had talked about doing with members of the board only a week earlier. Eventually, Elon would be invited onto the board, but the offer came with some strings attached. He would be prohibited from owning more than 15% of the company without the board's approval. He would no longer be able to publicly talk shit about the company on their own platform, and he wouldn't be able to submit offers to outright buy the company without the board's permission. Although initially on board with the proposal, Musk would change his mind a few days later and would instead offer to outright buy the company for $43 billion, or $54.20 per share. Some saw the offer as a hostile takeover, as if rejected, Musk could simply start buying outstanding shares until he had a controlling stake anyway. Regardless of his plan B, it was said on that day that he made the offer, Musk stayed up until 5:30 AM playing Elden Ring in a Vancouver hotel room. Musk supposedly did this to alleviate stress. However, judging by his choice of game, we can only speculate that his stress levels remained high. If Elden Ring veterans are able to interpret Elon's character stats into a build, you would solve a mystery long plaguing our team. A day after his initial offer, Twitter's board of directors would adopt what's called a poison pill strategy to prevent Musk's takeover. A poison pill strategy is a form of corporate jujitsu where the board can offer all shareholders a discount rate to buy new shares. The catch is that the offer extends to everyone except the largest shareholder, in this case, Elon Musk. This would make it infinitely more expensive to aggressively gain a controlling share of Twitter and dilute Musk's own share in the company. A poison pill strategy is designed in such a way that a person cannot take over a company without making a direct offer to the board. The poison pill was mostly just to buy time for the board, however, as at the end of the day, it's their job to act in the best interest of shareholders. And nothing says a fat payday quite like an outright acquisition. At this point, the board didn't need to worry about whether Twitter under Musk was going to thrive, whether its new business strategy would be viable, or if he could even afford the repayments for the purchase. At the end of the day, it wasn't their fucking problem. About a week later, and Musk had scraped together the now updated $44 billion price tag. This broke down to be around $20 billion from liquidating a stack of his Tesla shares, $13 billion in loans from a series of banks, and $7.1 billion from 19 independent investors. Of course, the CEO of any company can't just sell $20 billion worth of their own shares without people freaking the fuck out. This is why, on top of paying out $44 billion, the 12% drop in Tesla shares would further reduce Musk's net worth by another $30 billion the next day. On the 13th of May, almost a month after placing his initial offer, Musk would put the deal on hold following a report that 5% of Twitter's daily active users were spam accounts. What followed was a 5-month-long legal battle that we're not going to delve into too deeply. This is partly because it's not all that interesting, but mostly because we're sure as shit not qualified to break down a legal case worth $44 billion. By the 3rd of October 2022, Musk decided once again to honor the initial purchase agreement, on the condition that Twitter would drop its lawsuit. Musk's change of heart was seemingly due to an inability to prove that there was a material adverse effect justifying a break in the contract. In short, the stated concern for the spam accounts wasn't legally strong enough to cancel the deal. On the 27th of October, Musk was officially the sole owner of Twitter, which is really where the more exciting season 2 of our story begins. In the business world, when new CEOs are brought in to enact organizational change, some come in with a sledgehammer, while others come with a more meticulous scalpel approach. In this instance, Elon Musk took the Miley Cyrus approach because he came in like a fucking wrecking ball. This was now his ship, and as the sole owner, no one on God's green earth was going to tell him how to set sail. The very same day of the purchase, Musk would immediately fire 3 high-ranking executives before having security escort them off the premises. Not only were they not given the opportunity to resign, but this was a single day before their severance payments were expected to kick in. It was speculated that Musk fast-tracked the deal to avoid having to pay them out. Although we can't say for sure, there might be some truth in this argument, as these were the very same people he had just spent 5 months fighting in court. In any case, the executives would not get their severance package, but would later go on to sue Musk nearly 2 years later for their $128 million in unpaid bonuses. On the 4th of November, around a month after taking over, Musk would get to work laying off a significant portion of the workforce. Now, especially at the time, mass layoffs in the tech world were pretty common. Tech companies tended to overhire during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. AI was set to start replacing jobs, inflation was the highest it's been in 40 years, and there was a very real fear of an impending recession. Even with this in mind,
it was fucking biblical, mate.
It first started with the temporary closure of Twitter's American offices. Meanwhile, workers within Dublin and Tokyo received emails that they had been laid off, while employees within Britain and Ireland stayed in their offices into the night to find out whether or not they still had a job. Other employees only learned that they had been fired after being locked out of their work applications. And by the weekend, all offices worldwide were temporarily closed. 2 days later, Twitter would ask some laid-off employees to return to the company, either because they had been laid off by mistake or because they were later discovered to be too important to let go. Not long after, Mr. Musk would get to work firing 2 more groups, which included a metric fuck-ton of contractors, as well as people who had criticized him or his leadership. One engineer critical of Musk found out that they were fired through Elon tweeting it himself, which, as he would later learn, still might not be the most ironic thing to happen in this story. Around 2 weeks after the layoffs, Mr. Musk would email all remaining employees and give them a choice. Either they commit to working, quote, long hours at high intensity, or they can leave the company with 3 months of severance. Hundreds more would choose to leave by the next day. Once the dust settled, only around 2,000 of the nearly 8,000 employees remained at the company following the month of layoffs, and only around half of those would remain 6 months later. We should probably state that there's a case to be made for a wave of layoffs following the acquisition. From 2010 to 2021, Twitter had only made profit in 2 out of 12 years, and only in the years right before the dawn of COVID. In the tech world, however, this wasn't all that uncommon. Amazon famously only started turning a profit 9 years after its founding, as these type of companies usually rely on aggressive growth in their first few years to capture market share. As most businesses' biggest expense are their employees, there's a case to be made that the easiest way for Twitter to start turning a profit is to get rid of over 80% of them. As you might imagine, however, this can come with some serious problems. Following the initial layoffs, Twitter only had a single person left on its communications team, a team which was responsible for responding to the press. Of course, after a high-profile billionaire rapidly lays off the majority of their workforce, news organizations tend to reach out quite a bit, and Twitter sure as shit didn't have the manpower to respond. The company would alternatively opt to respond to every inquiry with a poop emoji. The problems wouldn't stop there, however, as the company would later be issued with an eviction notice following unpaid rent in its San Francisco offices. One report claimed that Musk himself had refused to pay as he wanted to renegotiate the contract, while some speculate that Twitter may have fired the guy in charge of paying the rent. In all honesty, we don't actually know. Laying off such a large workforce can come with quite a few legal challenges, and the company was hit by a case the following year which claimed it still owed over $500 million in unpaid severance to ex-workers. Of course, we're now 2,000 words into this shit show, and we haven't even talked about Musk's grand vision for Twitter, which would quickly come to define the platform. Before the acquisition, Mr. Musk was a self-described free speech absolutist, and was of the opinion that Twitter had not been doing enough to uphold the principles of free speech on its platform. He saw Twitter's future as the digital town square, where all ideas and opinions would be welcome to be discussed in an open setting. To address the ideological elephant in the room, Elon Musk's political views have trended to be leaning further to the right since the late 2010s, and this is important to understand if we're to discuss his policies. Prior to his stewardship, Mr. Musk accused the platform of having a left-wing bias, and especially at the time, there was a fair amount of fuel for this argument. After all, Twitter's headquarters is located in one of the most left-leaning areas of the country, and the year leading up to the takeover had already seen right-leaning accounts such as Jordan Peterson and the Babylon Bee banned for violating the community's hate speech policies. This was also less than 2 years after Twitter permanently suspended the account of sitting President Donald Trump, following the January 6th incident. To get to the bottom of this, a bias hearing led by a handful of Republican representatives would attempt to uncover such a left-leaning favoritism in 2023. What was instead found was that conservative accounts were quite often given a level of special treatment. A former Twitter executive explained that Twitter would change its content policies in real time to avoid having to take action against Donald Trump's account, and that Twitter's policy team had actually drafted rules to combat coded incitement to violence shortly before the January 6th incident took place. It was said that this proposal was not embraced by the higher-ups at the company. With this in mind, there is something to be said for the number of conservative accounts that get banned, as opposed to those who are more liberal-leaning. Combined research from Yale, MIT, and Exeter University found that conservative accounts were indeed suspended at higher rates. The whole fucking report is 33 pages long, but to save you some time, quote, "We argue that even under politically neutral anti-misinformation policies, such political asymmetries in enforcement should be expected, as there is a political asymmetry in the sharing of misinformation." Basically, the researchers found that there wasn't an ideological bias when it came to Twitter account bans, but rather conservative accounts were far more likely to share links to lower quality news sources, and therefore more likely to spread misinformation. Researchers at Indiana University would also find that content presented to fresh accounts would generally be exposed to political content to the right of their current ideological position. Twitter would even conduct an in-house study the year before the buyout, and would conclude that the right-leaning outlets saw greater amplification within Twitter's algorithm. Twitter's researchers explained that the bias was not an effort to promote any particular ideology, but rather simply a function of how the algorithm operates. There's of course a lot we could talk about for exactly why the algorithm would operate this way, the difference in how political views may affect the way people interact with Twitter, and whether world leaders should or shouldn't be held to a different standard. But let's move on in the interest of time. Knowing this piece of context, it's probably a good time to talk about the Twitter files. The Twitter files were a series of internal documents published by Twitter in the months following Musk's takeover, and handed over for review to a small list of hand-picked journalists. The Twitter files were a series of chat logs, screenshots, and emails from the company's content moderation team, and was intended to show the world how Twitter's previously closed internal moderation system operated. Once again, many right-leaning critics, including Elon Musk, had previously criticized the content moderation team for using policies to muzzle conservative views within the platform. and the Twitter files were going to be the hardest piece of evidence to prove so. Perhaps the biggest criticism of Twitter's moderation policies was the suppression of Hunter Biden's laptop story, with the company supposedly being ordered by the US government to censor it on the platform. With this in mind, researchers given access to the files found no such evidence that the government instructed Twitter to cover it up. In fact, nearly a year after Musk took charge, Musk's own lawyers contested many of the claims made by the Twitter files in court. What was even weirder is that in June 2023, Twitter attorneys admitted that although Republican officials were the most adamant that the government had pressured Twitter to censor content, they themselves submitted a huge number of takedown requests. According to Twitter's lawyers, Republican officials would make takedown requests so often that the company had to keep an entire database to track them. With this in mind, the Twitter files weren't an entirely overhyped nothing burger, as it was also discovered that the company had allowed accounts operated by the US military to run a Middle East influence campaign. Although these accounts were said to have been taken down, it's likely that similar campaigns are instead now being run in an unofficial capacity. Shady government agencies running influence campaigns really are at the heart of Twitter's DNA. With this said, let's get back to Musk's early attempt at content moderation. Immediately after assuming the helm, Mr. Musk would announce the formation of a Content Moderation Council. This was described as a group of people with diversified viewpoints who would decide the platform's policy for what would and wouldn't be allowed on the platform. The Moderation Council idea would be abandoned the following month, with Musk stating that a quote, large coalition of political, social activist groups had tried to kill the platform by pressuring advertisers to abandon it. We'll come back to advertisers later, but ultimately no such council was ever formed. What we certainly know for sure is that Musk's initial policy towards content moderation was very much in line with his stance of being a free speech absolutist. According to Yoel Roth, the former head of trust and safety at the company, Musk had instructed to halt all content moderation on the platform. Musk would soon reverse the decision after Roth explained that some forms of moderation are non-negotiable. As part of these new content policies, the platform would also discontinue its rules against COVID-19 misinformation, while the disbanding of Twitter's trust and safety teams allowed Russian propaganda to thrive. Now, as is the nature of the internet, as soon as the public figured out that content moderation was deprioritized, thousands of people took to the platform to start testing the waters. Only 12 hours after Musk became the new owner, the use of the N-word increased 500%. The use of the word Jew also went up fivefold, and there was a noticeable uptick in misogynistic language. This would freak out a lot of companies on Twitter who had a vested interest in only appearing in brand-safe environments. Following calls for advertisers to pull out of the platform, Yoel Roth would explain what happened at the time. Quote, my directions from Elon directly were, shut it down, get rid of all of it. He actually wanted us to go further than we had previously and said, it's not just about targeted hateful conduct, attacks on somebody. He's like, just take all of this stuff down. Get rid of all the slurs, get rid of all of it. And he pushed us to take a more aggressive position, shutting down free speech. He was doing it out of a recognition that advertisers objected to this content and were judging him and the new Twitter by our ability to effectively moderate it. Following this decision, he would go on to publicly tweet, quote, Twitter has had a massive drop in revenue due to activist groups pressuring advertisers, even though nothing has changed with content moderation and we did everything we could to appease the activists. Extremely messed up. They're trying to destroy free speech in America. Elon Musk, the famous free speech absolutist, would then instruct Roth to block posts supporting the advertising pause. The famous free speech absolutist would later be convinced that this was not a good idea. Facing public pressure and fearing Twitter was no longer brand safe, droves of advertisers would start leaving the platform. According to a report from Media Matters for America, half of Twitter's top 100 spenders left a month after the company went private. This was a big fucking deal, as 90% of Twitter's revenue is made through advertising, and the lion's share of this comes from its very top spenders. Lessons were learned, and content moderation was now seen as a vital component for sustained revenue. But without a trust and safety team, this is going to be difficult. Of course, a long list of academics had already been hard at work studying Twitter, and more specifically, the increase of hate speech on the platform. They, more than anyone, would be able to help understand how to best remain a more advertiser-friendly platform, and win back some of the more skittish brands. However, following Twitter's decision to withdraw access to its API in February of 2023, more than 100 ongoing studies were either cancelled or forced to be modified. What probably didn't help Twitter's content moderation problem was its decision to reinstate over 1,000 previously banned accounts, including none other than frog rights activist Alex Jones. Shortly after, a study by the BBC found that a third of these accounts would immediately go on to once again violate Twitter's guidelines. Less than a year after the acquisition, media monitoring group GLAAD would find Twitter to be, quote, the most dangerous platform for LGBTQ people, with the platform ranking lowest on its social media safety index. At around the same time, Twitter would go on to sue the Center for Countering Digital Hate, after it published research suggesting that 99% of hate content from Twitter Blue subscribers was not acted upon. The lawsuit was later dismissed in accordance with anti-SLAPP laws. Okay, at this point, content moderation is obviously an issue. Advertisers were leaving, and the company needed a way to keep the platform brand safe. This is when Twitter would come up with perhaps its most genius plan yet: Community Notes. The Community Notes feature allows contributors to fact-check or add context to posts on Twitter. Now, we should make clear that this wasn't Elon Musk's idea, as its predecessor, Birdwatch, launched around a year before Musk started eyeing up a purchase. The whole concept was for a complicated algorithm to determine the political alignments of individual contributors, then force them to agree on the correction written about a false or misleading post. The idea was that if the algorithm could find consensus from two people it had determined to be unlikely to agree on something, the Community Notes feature could be free from ideological bias. However, referring once again to the former head of Twitter's Trust and Safety, Yoel Roth, the Bird Box project was never intended to replace the curation team, but rather complement it. According to Community Notes insiders, the inner workings of the Community Notes system has constant infighting, very little oversight from Twitter, and is vulnerable to coordinated manipulation. A year following the acquisition, a European Commission study found Twitter to have the biggest proportion of disinformation from all social media sites measured. The study was conducted as a part of the EU's Code of Practice on Disinformation. However, Mr. Musk withdrew from the voluntary code shortly after taking over the company. Content moderation and manipulation was still a weak point for the company, but as long as Twitter was making money, everything was going to be okay. Unfortunately, the advertising exodus saw a lot of its revenue decrease shortly after the acquisition, which represented around $750 million a year from 50 advertisers alone. By the start of 2024, Fidelity Investments, which owns a stake in the company, valued Twitter at around $12.5 billion, down from its purchase of $44 billion less than 2 years earlier. It should be noted that this is also hot off the heels of Musk publicly calling out advertisers during an on-stage interview with the New York Times.
There was all of the criticism, there was advertisers leaving. We talked to Bob Iger today.
I hope they stop.
You hope?
Don't advertise.
You don't want them to advertise?
No.
What do you mean?
If somebody's going to try to blackmail me with advertising, blackmail me with money, go yourself.
But
go yourself. Is that clear? I hope it is.
Generally, when a company needs to get back into the black, it can either try to increase its revenue stream or try to cut costs. Now obviously, after getting rid of 80% of your staff, there probably isn't too much more wiggle room for cutting costs, so revenue streams it is. This would come in the form of monetizing Twitter's verification system. Hilarity would ensue. Back in 2009, Twitter recognized the need for users to be able to verify themselves. After all, it would be all too easy for someone to just make an account impersonating a celebrity, brand, or government agency, and they would be functionally indistinguishable from the real thing. Along comes the introduction of the blue check, a tiny symbol given to notable accounts to prove their authenticity to the world. Of course, this would come with its own source of problems, as deciding who did and didn't require such verification became something of a clusterfuck for the company. In time, the blue check itself would come to mean something of a status symbol. Shortly after taking over, Musk would identify the blue check system as a potential revenue stream, and instead of verifying notable accounts, anyone could buy a subscription to Twitter Blue for just $20 a month. The subscription would come with such benefits as having a verification check on your account, the ability to edit posts, increased file size uploads, and the luxury of experiencing 50% less ads. Somewhat ironically, Twitter would later allow advertisers to choose to show their ads exclusively to subscribers of this service. Following backlash, the price of Twitter Blue would subsequently be reduced to $8 a month. The company had just gutted the majority of its workforce. Its ability to moderate content was at an all-time low, and the platform was now the leading source of disinformation on the internet. On top of this, Twitter was now about to sell verification to anyone with $8 in their pocket. This was going to be perfect. Almost immediately, users began setting up and verifying fake accounts of notable people, government agencies, and various multinational companies. An account impersonating Nestle would post, quote, "We steal your water and sell it back to you, lol." Another account pretending to be BP would tweet, "Just because we killed the planet doesn't mean we can't miss it." It also seemed as if Musk's own companies also weren't free from manipulation, with a verified Tesla account tweeting, "Breaking, a second Tesla is hit the World Trade Center." Another fun example was a tweet from a user impersonating Nintendo of America, who posted a picture of Mario giving the middle finger. Nintendo is the type of company to sue someone so hard, they'll be required to pay nearly a third of everything they earn for the rest of their life. This is the same company who used to copyright claim all YouTube videos featuring their games on YouTube, and would more recently threaten legal action against creators of 20-year-old mods. If that's how they operate to protect their intellectual property, you can imagine that the Nintendo executives were probably planning to have Elon Musk killed in his sleep. This treatment was even extended to former US President George Bush, who would lament in his own special way that he really missed the Iraq War. Now, for Twitter's users, this free-for-all of impersonating anyone they wanted to for the low price of $8 a month was quite a lot of fun. However, let's not forget that the reason why the verification system was changed in the first place was to compensate for the exodus of advertisers from the platform. For some companies, though, the new Twitter Blue system was monumentally damaging. A fake tweet from aerospace and defense company Lockheed Martin read, quote, "We will begin halting all weapon sales of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States until further investigation into their record of human rights abuses." This tweet would go on to drop the company's share price 5.5%, the equivalent of more than $7 billion. In another case, pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly would experience another imposter account, which tweeted, "We are excited to announce insulin is free now." Its stock price would also fall nearly 4.5%, erasing $15 billion in market cap. After Twitter Blue was temporarily suspended, the service came back with measures to stop illegitimate accounts. With this in mind, the damage was already done. Many brands had already pulled out, and the plan to use Twitter Blue subscriptions to replace them had dramatically backfired. If we can assume a single large advertiser pulled away from Twitter and they were spending a relatively modest $1 million a year on advertising, the company would need to convince 125,000 people to sign up to Twitter Blue to replace them. If Twitter wanted to make up the estimated $750 million from half of its top 50 advertisers, it would then need to get nearly 94 million subscribers. Now, for reference, Netflix currently has 270 million subscribers, and they're actually offering something. I suppose now would be a good time to mention that Elon Musk's new position as the face of Twitter had also started causing some problems among its user base. You see, as we previously mentioned, a big part of Musk's decision to buy the platform was because he saw it as having too much of a left-wing bias. And he himself had very publicly supported a number of right-leaning figures and politicians. Musk's Twitter purchase was also right in the middle of the US midterm elections in 2022, leaving a divided US public even more on edge. As a result, Twitter Blue, and by extension a profile's subsequent blue check, quickly turned into something of a political statement, similar to profiles using a rainbow filter to show their support for Pride Month. To supporters, the new blue check subscription was the end of an elitist system, where people were either deemed important enough to be verified or just another chump. They argued that at $8 a month, everyone could now be treated equally, and that this money would be spent on creating a platform that better upholds the principles of free speech. The other side were the Musk naysayers, people who didn't particularly like the new policies or Musk's personal ideology. Some didn't like Twitter Blue because they didn't think the features justified $8 a month. Others thought that monetizing Twitter's verification system defeated its whole purpose, as most people probably weren't at risk of being interesting enough to be imitated. There was also the subsection who may have previously paid for the subscription, but were afraid of looking like someone who liked Elon Musk. Aware of Twitter Blue turning into a controversial status symbol, Mr. Musk would personally pay for the subscription of a number of celebrities who had been openly critical of him, including author Stephen King and NBA star LeBron James. Now, for Musk, personally buying and applying Twitter Blue subscriptions for some of his most vocal critics was a perfect way to troll them. But it did come with some risks. Legal experts argued that due to the subscription's polarizing nature, those who had the service unwillingly applied on their accounts actually had some legal recourse. This was because it could be argued that a public figure was being seen to endorse a product unwillingly. Legal experts also reasoned that due to the public disdain for blue checkmarks, celebrities affected also had a case for the platform damaging their reputations. The polarization of Twitter Blue eventually reached a stage where there were guides on how to automatically filter out accounts who had subscribed to the service, and Twitter would later add the option for subscribers to hide their blue check if they felt too embarrassed about paying for it. The subscription service would also come into some trouble when people discovered that members could upload videos up to 8 gigabytes onto the platform. Although perhaps not all that interesting to most people, to some, this would allow them effectively unlimited cloud storage for a much lower price than competing services. Twitter Blue certainly wouldn't be the last controversial decision made by the platform over the next year, as in June 2023, it would begin to limit the number of tweets a person could view per day. Twitter Blue subscribers would be able to view 6,000 posts a day, while free accounts and new accounts were limited to 600 and 300 posts respectively. Musk himself would later state that these limits were designed to address the problem of data scraping and system manipulation within the platform. But this obviously comes with additional problems. Firstly, with the way Twitter Blue is designed, only a few hundred posts a day wasn't all that much for a lot of users, with some stating that it took them a matter of minutes before they were essentially locked out for the day. We should also probably mention the effect on advertising revenue, as the last thing a social media platform wants to do is to limit the retention of its user base. This was also the same time that the platform disabled the ability for users to view content without having an account. Following public backlash, limits to daily viewing and login requirements to view content would be rolled back. Only a few months later, Twitter would start trialing another controversial change. In October 2023, the platform had begun charging all new users from both New Zealand and the Philippines an annual fee of $1. Users would now have to pay the subscription to gain access to features such as posting or replying to tweets. And this change was set to trial whether users would be willing to pay for these features on the platform. Fast forward to April 2024, and Musk would announce that new users would soon have to pay in order to start posting on Twitter, citing that this would be a measure to reduce the number of bots. We now start getting into policies which could be described as more personal to Musk himself. Perhaps the most famous incident was the banning of the Elon Jet account, a Twitter bot which was set up to track Musk's private jet in real time using publicly accessible data. Following the ban, Musk would state, quote, "Any account doxing real-time location info of anyone will be suspended, as it is a physical safety violation. This includes posting links to sites with real-time location info. Posting locations someone traveled to on a slightly delayed basis isn't a safety problem, so is okay." The ban came only a month after Musk had previously tweeted, quote, "My commitment to free speech extends to not banning the account following my plane, even though that is a direct personal safety risk." The Elon Jet account had long been a pain point for the on and off richest man in the world, and its creator, a college student named Jack Sweeney, had previously stated that he was once offered a sum of $5,000 to take it down. Days before the account was banned, Sweeney had accused Musk of having his account shadow banned. Mr. Sweeney revealed what appeared to be internal communications from Twitter's Trust and Safety division, which had ordered employees to suppress the account's reach. Sweeney suspects that his ban stemmed from anger over these leaks. However, the Associated Press was not able to independently verify these claims. What we do know, however, is that the day following the account ban, Twitter would go on to ban multiple journalists who had been covering the Elon Jet incident. Later on, Mr. Musk would be questioned on these suspensions on a Twitter Spaces mass audio call. Musk would then quit the call, and shortly after, the entire Twitter Spaces service would be temporarily taken down. Although Mr. Musk attributed the shutdown to a software bug, a software engineer at the company would state that the service had been taken down. Most suspended journalists would later be unbanned, but would be unable to post new tweets until their policy-violating posts had been removed. Whether Mr. Musk would manipulate the algorithm for personal reasons isn't really a question we need to ask. Following a personal experiment by Musk in February 2023, he called upon Twitter engineers to explain why he had been experiencing declining reach on the platform. A principal engineer would later suggest that the lower level of engagement on his tweets was due to what was described as easily chartable waning public interest in Musk. Other Twitter employees would go on to provide internal data, which would correspond with a Google Trend chart to back up this theory. The engineer who suggested this theory would be subsequently fired by Musk. The billionaire would then tell the rest of his engineers that the platform was either going to be fixed by the end of the weekend or they would also be looking for another job. To fix this problem, the engineers would simply alter Twitter's algorithm to boost Musk's personal tweets. Now you might think that this would mean an increase of say 20 or 30%, and if they really wanted to go overboard, maybe amplify his tweets 5 or even 10 times their previous value. However, with their jobs on the line, the engineers weren't able to take any fucking chances, and would go on to boost Musk's tweets by a factor of 1,000. At this stage, we should also circle back around to news organizations, another group which has since experienced a tumultuous time on the platform. In April 2023, Twitter would go on to make the decision to brand news organization NPR as US state-affiliated media. This was in itself quite a break from Twitter's previous policies, as the state-affiliated media label was previously only reserved for outlets which directly represented the views of their respective government. Outlets like Xinhua, the official state news agency of the Chinese government, or RT, a Russian state-controlled propaganda network. After initial pushback, Twitter would later change the designation of NPR to government-funded media. NPR would once again take issue with this label, stating that less than 1% of its funding was taken from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That same month, NPR would decide to no longer be active on Twitter, and just over a week later, Twitter would stop labeling state-affiliated media entirely. On the topic of being state-affiliated, Musk's acquisition would also go on to see the platform approve 80% of all government-requested censorship requests, up from 50% the year before the buyout. In perhaps the most notable case, Musk would restrict hundreds of tweets and 4 key accounts from within Turkey, the day before its 2023 election. The accounts were all very vocal critics of the incumbent president Recep Tayyip Erdogan, a man who had overseen a steady decline of democracy within the country over the past 2 decades. Responding to criticism of this decision, Musk would argue that it would be better to have a handful of accounts limited than to have the platform taken down completely for an entire country. However, critics have argued that having the entire platform forcibly shut down a day before an election would serve as a far stronger statement for the principles of free speech. The idea is that filtering out criticism of a certain person is much worse than simply shutting the whole thing down to let the election operate on an even playing field. There's also the fact that Elon had previously met with Erdogan on several occasions, once discussing potential collaborations between Musk's companies and firms within Turkey. We can't find any evidence that these personal ties would influence Twitter's policy towards censorship within the country, but it's certainly an important piece of context. In any case, what we can say for sure is that free speech absolutist Elon Musk complied with a request to censor criticism of an authoritarian leader the day before a national election. At this point, we should probably start trying to make sense of everything, because the purchase of Twitter isn't your average investment. With how much Elon Musk seemed to devalue his own company, there's likely 2 different explanations. The first is that Musk is simply surrounded by yes-men, employees that are either supportive of his stewardship of Twitter, or perhaps too scared to tell him that something is a bad idea. With how much the workforce was initially culled, and how he's been known to fire people who criticize him, it's perhaps likely that the people who are left are the least likely to disagree with Musk's policies. The second explanation is that purchasing Twitter was never about the money, and if you're the richest person on planet Earth, this becomes very likely. If Musk wanted more money, he simply could have just parked his $42 billion in a high-interest savings account and scored himself a guaranteed $10 billion within 5 years. He wouldn't have to go to any meetings, deal with any lawsuits, and he could just chill out on some private island in the company of a beautiful white beach and an army of bored models. Instead, Musk decided to buy something that obviously meant a lot to him personally. An online platform which he's been using for several hours a day for the past decade. The richest person in the world doesn't need money, but with his long list of strong personal views and his global business interests, he could certainly stand to gain more influence. Before social media platforms rose in prominence, the easiest ways for a rich guy to become more powerful was to either run for election or start their own newspaper, and in some cases, both at the same time. In Australia, for example, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott once said that media magnate Rupert Murdoch, quote, arguably has had more impact on the wider world than any other living Australian. Murdoch is famously the owner of a number of news outlets all around the world, including The Sun, The Times, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Post, Sky News Australia, and Fox News. Murdoch has also been known to keep unprofitable papers alive even when they're bleeding money because their real value is an arm of global influence. In terms of Twitter, it wouldn't be hard to argue that Elon Musk similarly sees the $44 billion price tag as his opportunity to become a modern-day titan of media. Twitter has no obligation to shareholders, meaning the company never has to make another cent as long as Musk can keep funding it. On top of this, social media algorithms have long been known to radicalize people unintentionally already. These algorithms have a tendency to feed users content that they're interested in, or align with their own personal views. This can obviously be beneficial when it comes to topics like sport or video games, but political topics tend to make people more divisive. This is because it allows users to live in personalized bubbles which may not affect reality, but rather keeps feeding them content to justify their own views, or discredit those who don't agree with them. For the most part, these filter bubbles are merely a consequence of algorithms trying to maintain user retention. But if they were actually instructed to be directly manipulated, they could become the most effective influence apparatus known to man. The Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed how extremely powerful a social media leverage influence campaign can be. And they didn't outright own an entire social media platform. With such close margins for so many elections around the world, it wouldn't be insane to think that Twitter could absolutely be used to sway the results of more than a few of them, all just by tweaking its algorithm. Of course, this is theoretical, but even now there are signs of subtle manipulations of public sentiment. Something we neglected to mention about Twitter Blue subscriptions, a service which has since been renamed, is called prioritized ranking. This means that if all factors remain equal, comments made by paying subscribers will be prioritized above those who have not paid for such a service. Once again, we should remind viewers that the Twitter Blue service was an ideological point of contention among users of the platform, and those who had signed up were generally some of the most supportive Elon Musk fans on the site. We probably don't need to tell you that having a system that therefore ranks these users higher than other users on the platform could come to shape how the public perceives common sentiment towards a huge number of usually divisive topics. This becomes even more worrisome when we look at Musk's end goal for Twitter, describing it as an everything app. This would be a person's one-stop shop for social media, payments and banking, video and audio, online shopping, food delivery, and even gaming. Anything a person would need without ever leaving Twitter. As crazy as this might sound, China has actually had an everything app for several years now called WeChat, which does exactly the same thing. The problem, as you might imagine, is having an everything app also puts a lot of control in the hands of its owners. And in this case, the Chinese government. Beijing was known to censor messages concerning COVID-19, the infamous 2019 Hong Kong elections, and even a post made by the then-serving Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. We know what could happen if an everything app falls into the wrong hands, and Americans especially should probably ask themselves if Elon Musk's hands are to be trusted with this kind of power. Of course, you could also take Elon Musk at face value, a tech billionaire who has always painted a vision of a cleaner future, space travel, and upgrading humanity with cybernetics. Twitter under Musk was promised to be a free speech absolutist's dream, the de facto public town square, and a platform whose policies would be guided by a diverse team of experts. However, Musk has shown how quickly he is willing to disregard free speech when he finds it even slightly inconvenient. His public town square has become nothing but a pay-to-win free-for-all with his voice artificially amplified above all others. Meanwhile, his content moderation is currently outsourced to a dysfunctional and easily manipulatable crowdsourced system to save money. There is a reason that Musk's stewardship has become a case study in business schools for what absolutely not to do when taking over a company. This is a very special case where a person has mismanaged a company so badly that you could have put a monkey in charge of the CEO position, and as long as no one actually listened to the monkey, the company would be in a better place than what it is right now. People have long joked that Elon Musk is the closest thing the world has to a real-life supervillain, and the closer you look, the more you might start to agree.